For Senator Fausto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is AKA Day at the Capitol. Sorority sisters are here. Would you please stand in your pink and green? And thank you for being here with us today. The senator, he likes pink and green.
Pink and green is wonderful. So thank you and welcome to the committee this morning. Before we get started, are there any bill introductions? I believe we do. Former Senator Rucker. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, presidential preference primary, 23 RS 1643.
Committee, any discussion or objections to introduction to that bill? Senator Fausto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rucker, so presidential elections to change the date or time?
Actually, to reinstate the presidential preference primary into law.
Any further discussion or objections? Seeing none, that bill is introduced.
Thank you.
Any other bill introductions this morning? Seeing none, we will move on to our first hearing. By the way, before we get started, committee, I do anticipate working some bills Thursday and Friday at this point. So still working on that, but we'll let you know on that. Okay, we're going to open the hearing on HB 2087, which we had to skip over yesterday. And for the bill summary, we'll go to Jason Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 2087 makes amendments to election statutes regarding the selection of presidential electors. These are the individuals who are selected by the party to go to Washington and vote in the Electoral College election for the President of the United States. Currently, state laws provide for the nomination of presidential electors in the same manner as candidates for office. What the bill would do would require those recognized political parties to adopt procedures for the selection of presidential electors for their party, and then make those selections in accordance with those procedures that they have adopted. The bill also makes some amendments to clarify how the names of those presidential electors are certified to the Secretary of State. The main change there is if the party has no state organization, then the names are certified by the national organization. Or if the candidate is an independent candidate, then it's the candidate themselves who certify the names of the presidential electors. And those names are to be certified by September 1st of the year of the presidential election. These changes would go into effect on July 1st of this year, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions? Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I guess I would like to, right now, my understanding, the political parties themselves, they select electors?
Yes.
Okay. And so how would this change it? Besides, they have to write it down, how they're going to select it? Or I don't understand.
Well, I think current law kind of dictates a particular procedure for the parties to select. This allows the parties to just adopt whatever procedures they decide to adopt to select those presidential electors. And I think the proponent of the bill has some background context as to the necessity for this change that might further answer your question. So if you don't mind me deferring to him, thank you.
Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, we'll open our proponent oral testimony. We only have one, and that's Clay Barker from the Secretary of State. And give you about 5 minutes, Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee. Glad to be back today. This bill came about because the Secretary of State had one legislative priority for this year, and that was the bill you heard yesterday, the cleanup bill. Then in December of 2022, the federal government enacted the the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022, which modified the old electoral count statute, federal statute. So I, over Christmas, had to go through the entire new federal law to see if there were any inconsistencies with Kansas state law. And from that, we found 3 that are in this bill, and they're fairly minor. One is that the certificate of ascertainment, that's a document signed by the governor that says here are the electors and how many votes they got, has to be distributed to all 6 electors. Our law just said give it to 1. Second, that the meeting of the electors has to be held now on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday in December. It used to be the first Monday, and all electors meet at the same time across the country on the same day in the state capitol. And the third is the federal government enacted a procedure to object to an elector by having a special 3-judge federal panel. That's now been put into our electoral contest statute. Now, as long as we were on the subject of electors, there's a few other cleanup provisions that originally were in the bill you heard yesterday, but were moved to this because they're specific to electors. And just with Mr. Rucker in the room, the presidential preference primary has nothing to do with the electors. That has to do with delegates to the National Convention. People sometimes get confused on that if you're listening. And I wanted to thank Jason for putting up with us on all this cleanup stuff. The cleanup provisions were this. In 1961 and in 1981, the legislature passed laws telling the state party how to pick their electors, and those 2 provisions were completely inconsistent with each other. Then in 1990, the Attorney General, based on some U.S. Supreme Court decisions, said both of those provisions were unconstitutional, and state parties can pick their electors any way they see fit. Unfortunately, those provisions were left in state law, and every election year for president, people would call up wanting to know why we weren't forcing the parties to follow the law. We had to tell them the provisions were unconstitutional, and they wanted to know why they were still in our laws after 30 years. So this is why we're cleaning them up. And all we say now is the party must have a process and must follow its process. There's no more dictation of details. The other provisions that were added in for cleanup is we clarified how a non-state political party gets its electors in, like the Green Party or Reform Party, and also a completely independent candidate, like a Ross Perot, would get his electors on. We also set a deadline when the people have to give the Secretary of State the electors of 1 September. That was always our aspirational goal. And last, there was an old statute from 1868 that has never been changed that set the reimbursement for electors, and we just got rid of that because no one has ever asked for it. If you wanted to know, it was $3 a day and 15 cents a mile, I guess railroad and horse carts. This passed 122-0. I don't believe there are any opponents. And if I could take just a second, I see I have a minute left. I was an elector in 2016 for Donald Trump. And if any of you ever get the chance to be an elector, have a second email, because I started getting 25,000 emails a day, which I know you get a lot too. And the only benefit you get is you get to go to Washington and sit on a cold metal chair in the rain instead of having to stand in the back. But really, there's nothing much else to it except signing some documents. And Mr. Chair, I'll stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
Okay. Actually, Clay, I'll leave you up there in case there are any additional questions, because we have no neutral or opponent testimony. Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my question is probably for you or Sheila. I'm wondering if the testimony has been moved because I'm not accessing it online.
You might hit refresh on your and see if that works. Sometimes it doesn't come up immediately, or it's on the S drive also. Yeah, it would be. Sometimes you have to hit refresh to access it and get that data. Senator Reichman, did you have a question?
Thank you. I might have misunderstood, but did you say that somebody could challenge your electors and how they go about doing that?
Senator Reichman, I mean, any elected official can have an election contest filed against them. Now, congressmen and senators are exempt from that because the U.S. House of Representatives and Senator are the judge of the qualifications of their own members. And there was nothing on how to challenge a presidential elector saying this person should not be an elector because they're not a resident, they're wrong age, whatever. And the federal law requires a 3-judge federal court to handle those because they are federally elected officials. And we put that in our Kansas election contest statute where all the other provisions about contesting elected officials are located.
Because my question would, I mean, if the party picked I don't know why somebody would challenge. That's why I was wondering. Thank you.
Senator, I believe, and I don't have the federal legislative history, it's if there might be 2 slates of electors from the same state. How would you go about challenging one as legitimate as opposed to the other? But Kansas has never had that problem since 1864.
Any other questions? I would like to leave that $3 in because that's worth like a cup of coffee or something like that, right? No, I'm just kidding.
Senator, I was just going off the, all things being equal, fewer laws are better, but it
Yeah, I
doesn't bother us
understand.
one way or the other.
Thank you, Clay. I don't think there's any more questions for you. And like I said, no opponent or neutral testimony unless there's somebody in the audience who would like to testify against this. If not, seeing none, we will close the hearing on House Bill 2087. Thank you, sir. Okay, committee, next up, we've got Senate Bill 303. We're going to have the hearing on that. It's establishing Kansas Legal Tender Act, and I'm going to have Jason give us the brief on that bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 303 would create the Kansas Legal Tender Act. The act defines legal tender as a recognized medium of exchange for the payment of debts and taxes, and it also defines specie as coin having gold or silver content or refined gold or silver bullion that is coined, stamped, or imprinted with its weight and purity and valued primarily based on the metal content and not its form. What the act does with those definitions is basically establish that the specie, these coins, gold and silver coins, would be legal tender in the state of Kansas and treated as standard money for purposes of taxation and regulation of personal property, which means you can't tax it and regulate it as personal property because it is legal tender. There is a provision, Section 5, that no person would be required to accept these coins as legal tender, although they are included in the definition. And then Section 7 of the bill amends the income tax statute for taxpayers to allow Kansas taxpayers to deduct the net gain from the sale of such coins from the federal adjusted gross income for Kansas income tax purposes. The taxpayer would still be subject to whatever federal taxation is on those gains from that sale, but they would not be subject to Kansas income tax on that income. If enacted, the bill will go into effect on July 1st of this year. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir. We're going to give, we have our proponent oral testimony. Each person will have 5 minutes. If you don't need the 5 minutes, don't take it. And we'll start off with John Axtell, Coordinator, Kansas Campaign for Liberty. John.
Good morning. I'm John Axtell. I'm the Volunteer Coordinator for Kansas Campaign for Liberty. And Honorable Chairman and members of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee, I obviously support this bill. I thank you for your time, and I'd like to first go over the history, a brief history of the bill. We wrote it back about 4 to 5 years ago. It was introduced in 2019, 2020, where the sales tax exemption was passed. It was edited to accommodate that fact or account for that, and reintroduced again in 2021, 22 in that session. I want to thank Representative Murphy for introducing it in the House this year and for bringing it to the attention of this committee. There are several provisions written into the bill that are designed to keep Kansas and Kansans safe. And the first is that as the person preceding me, I forgot his title, I'm sorry, but as he said, nobody can be forced to make a transaction in gold or silver money according to this bill. And what that means is that if a person has a U.S. silver dollar, its face value is $1. That person cannot be forced to pay a $1 fiat currency debt using that silver dollar. That's not possible. That would be essentially stealing. That's forbidden in this bill. The second thing is we want to protect Kansans from misunderstanding the purpose of this bill by saying only the coins minted in U.S. mints are declared legal tender. Federal regulatory agencies can speak to what is legal tender. We don't want to cross paths with those folks. They can change their mind any time, and we don't want this bill to have to be changed on a repeated basis to accommodate that. We're very certain that, or extremely confident that they will never declare U.S. minted coins not to be legal tender, and that's why this is written this way. Finally, we do not make the Federal Reserve note, the current fiat dollar, unconstitutional or not legal tender. We don't ban it in this bill. That would be very imprudent. Although Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution does say that no state shall make or declare anything but gold or silver coin to be tender in the payment of debt. Although it says that, And our fiat currency does not meet that requirement, and we could do so. Although that is the case, we don't go there. We just simply want to give Kansans a choice. So finally, I'd like to look at the graph of the debt to GDP ratio that is the last page of my testimony. There are two dates there that are very important. 1913 is when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and it was created subsequent to that. The other date is 1971, which is when this country went off of the gold and silver standard and is still off of the gold and silver standard. From 1913 on, you'll see, going into 1913, the debt to GDP ratio was roughly 10%, according to that graph. And this graph is based on federal data. But since then, with a Federal Reserve that is supposed to make things better, since that time, the debt to GDP ratio has never returned to as low as 10%. After World War II, after World War I, it came down in the mid-20s to roughly 15 to 20%. After World War II, by the 1970s, it came down to roughly 30%. But the second thing is that from 1971 on, after our fiat currency became our currency, you'll see that it has gone up, simply skyrocketed in that time, and that's a time of relative peace and prosperity. That is unprecedented. Never before has it done that. Only in time of war and during the Great Depression has our ratio skyrocketed. So I urge you to pass this out of committee, and thank you for your time, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, John. And committee will hold for questions till all the proponent testimony. Up next is J.P. Cortez, Sound Money Defense League. J.P.? And I'll give you a 1 minute cue or 30 seconds or close if you get close to your 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is J.P. Cortez, and I'm the Policy Director of the Sound Money Defense League, and I stand as a proponent of Senate Bill 303. I submitted testimony with many of these points, so I do intend to be very brief. I don't think I'll need the cue. Firstly, under current law, when a taxpayer sells precious metals, they may end up with a capital gain. The issue is that many times this is a nominal gain. The reason an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold, it's priced differently because the value of the dollar is changing, not because an ounce of gold is changing. So this nominal gain, even though it's not a real gain, even though the value of the gold is the value of gold, taxpayers are taxed on that. And then this nominal gain is taxed on the federal level and then again by the state, so it's subject to double taxation. Next, in an era of raging inflation, states are trying to find safe places to protect state taxpayer funds and their own state funds. To just name a few, Alabama, Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, Maine, Missouri, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and South Carolina are currently considering this same measure that's before this committee today. Just last week, Iowa passed it out of the full House. We're expecting movement in Idaho this week and several other bills as well. Arizona, Utah, and Wyoming have already passed similar legislation to this. Again, and this is largely against a backdrop of inflation that is almost unprecedented, that hasn't been seen in decades. In total, there are 21 states this year that have introduced more than 40 pieces of legislation to eliminate taxes on gold and silver, capital gains taxes or sales taxes like Kansas did here recently, to establish in-state depositories for the state to hold gold, to enable state treasurers to invest state funds in gold and silver if they so choose, and more. So there's a lot of appetite for sound money at a time where the money itself, the US dollar, appears to be faltering. So for that reason and many others, I encourage you guys to vote yes on Senate Bill 303. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JP. Up next, and you only took 2 minutes, good job. Up next, we have Vince Bateman, private citizen. Vince, and we'll give you 5 minutes.
I'd like to start by saying thank you to the committee to let me to be able to come up here and speak to the committee. This is a real privilege. I'm not affiliated with anyone. I'm just a citizen off the street. I work for a local trash company. I do presentations on financial collapses and stuff like that. So like I say, there's no profit or benefit I get out of that. That's all free. to tell to the citizens. Again, I am for SB Bill 303. And the reason why I say this, I want to give like a little history lesson here. And I brought my props in. I didn't bring all my props in, but I brought a lot of them in. If I was to do this presentation, it'd take about 45 minutes, but I'm going to consolidate it down. To start off, our country, back in the colonial area in the 1770s, had a Continental. This is a Continental from 1776. The Continental was highly inflated and it collapsed. And down below you see that's where the term "ain't worth the Continental" come about. See, the Continental, I mean, in the 1770s, like I say, it highly inflated. A wagon load of Continentals wouldn't buy you a suit. And it's interesting to see how history plays out. And there's a lot to this. And what the forefathers did is they took out the Continental and then they went to gold and silver as the standard of money, which is God's money. Okay, as I go down through the history here, this is the Weimar Republic. This currency here was what helped brought Hitler to power. In pre-World War I, the currency went from 4 or 5 Reichsmarks to $1. By 1923, the Reichsmarks was basically 23 million to $1. Or if you were trading in gold and silver, 1 ounce of silver you'd buy about an ounce of silver pre-World War I for 5 Reichsmarks. By 1933 is 23 million. So the taxes on this, I don't want to be taxed on something that just because they hyperinflated the currency, I don't want to be taxed on that. I don't see where that would be fair. I stand up for the citizens because this here, like I say, is what helped brought Hitler to power. Okay. This is the 1 billion Reichsmark. This was towards the end of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic went down in 1933. And as you know who was coming up through the power then. When currencies collapse, evil people come to power. And these resets come along a lot and throughout history. Now I'm going to go over to the United States. There's many countries that has fallen. This prop here is the United States currency. As you see at the top is gold and silver. And there along the right side there, that's constitutional silver. That is what the forefathers set up for us. Over here is clad coinage, what you have today. And as you see, you're seeing a collapse of a nation. This is a canary in the coal mine. And what they're pushing us towards is a CBDC, and you do not want that in. But I would like to see gold and silver used as a form of money in this state to help the citizens of Kansas. There's so much wealth creation through derivatives, the XF market, the United States is basically 30 billion. And China's 3 trillion. Again, folks, I'd really highly would like to see everybody study up on this. And like I say, I stand for SB 303. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Vince. I appreciate it. Our final oral proponent is Blake Branson. He's a private citizen and is on WebEx. And you have 5 minutes, Blake. If we've got Blake.
Thank you. Honorable Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be before you by video and for hearing such an important and timely issue. Gold and silver are honest money. They don't make promises they can't keep, and they don't require the trust of a politician or central banker to maintain their value. That was Ron Paul, Chairman of Campaign for Liberty and former member of Congress. As we speak, the latest banking crisis is underway. Multiple banks have failed. The FDIC, U.S. Treasury, and Federal Reserve are providing bailouts to attempt to stop a run on the banks. If we followed what the Constitution demands, Kansans would have a safe haven to protect themselves from the chaos currently being inflicted upon us. That's what this bill is about. SB 303 would recognize gold and silver as money and exempt them from state taxation. By exempting precious metals from taxation, you give Kansans the option to shield themselves from recession, inflation, and the banking crises currently being caused by the Federal Reserve and out of control federal government spending and debt. It can't be overstated the impact that the removal of sound money has had on our society. One of those impacts is to disincentivize saving money and thrift while incentivizing risks like spending beyond our means and taking on new debt. When the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates by lowering them, they encourage taking on more debt while completely removing the benefits of saving money and spending responsibly. From regular Americans to the federal government's $31 trillion national debt, the effect is devastating. Banks and the rich are incentivized to leverage more and more of their wealth in increasingly risky manners. The poor and middle class see the now fruitless and risky prospects of saving money thanks to inflation and are incentivized to live beyond their means or take on more debt. When the risk and malinvestment catches up, as it always does, it is the poor and middle class that takes the brunt of that impact. The rug is pulled out from under them when it becomes more difficult to borrow money, when variable interest rates change on current debt, when prices go up, when the job markets become shaky, and then to top it all off, they end up being the means by which the banks and the rich are bailed out from their risky investments. It is no wonder that the wealth gap continues to grow the way that it does. Whatever the intent, the actions of the Federal Reserve have led to devastating consequences for working Americans. While another of their disasters is unfolding before our eyes, you have the ability to remove power from the Federal Reserve and return it to where it belongs. You have the power to make a significant difference for hardworking Kansans looking to preserve the value of their hard-earned money. I strongly urge you to support SB 303 to return honest, sound, and constitutional money to its rightful place. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Blake. Committee, we have 5 written-only proponent testimonies available to you. Hopefully you have an opportunity to look at those. And we have no opponent or neutral testimony. Are there any questions for any of the conferees? Seeing none, thank you for your time, conferees. It's a very interesting topic. Senate Bill, the hearing on Senate Bill 303 is closed. And now we will move on to opening the hearing on House Bill 2059, amending the alcoholic liquor and cereal malt beverage common consumption area law. And I'll have Jason give us a brief on that bill. Jason.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, House Bill 2059 amends one statute under the Club and Drinking Establishment Act 41-2659. This statute was passed a few years back to authorize municipalities to create common consumption areas for the consumption of alcoholic liquor on public streets, roadways, walkways, which is generally prohibited under Kansas liquor regulations. The way this works is the city or county typically would pass an ordinance or resolution establishing the area that is to be the common consumption area, and then applies to ABC and gets a common consumption permit so that alcoholic liquor can be consumed within the boundaries of that common consumption area. The statute also has a number of requirements for the management of these areas, and one of those requirements is that all roadways that for motor vehicle traffic that pass through the common consumption area must be blocked off, and there must be physical barriers to prevent motor vehicle traffic. The bill would amend this to make blocking roadways discretionary for the city or county establishing the common consumption area. You can see on page 1 of the bill, line 16, changes a shall to a may. So the city may block off the roads, or the county may block off the roads in the area when they establish it, but not necessarily required to do so. Also, you notice on page 3, with respect to physical barriers, there's also or appropriate signage can be placed marking the boundaries of that common consumption area, not necessarily a physical barrier. In appropriate cases, again, that's left largely to the discretion of the municipality that has established the area for common consumption. This will go into effect on July 1st of this year, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, questions, Senator Reichman?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jason. Now, my understanding the cities can do this now.
That's correct.
Okay, but this is where they have option out, they want to close down a road, and they have to put signs, the boundaries where it's going to be in. Am I understanding this correctly?
The boundary, the marking the boundaries of the consumption area is already required. The bill modifies that to allow signage rather than necessarily physical barriers. The real policy change is it gives the city's discretion as to whether or not to close the roads going through the common consumption area. Current law requires them that any public street or roadway that lies within a common consumption area shall be blocked from motorized traffic. The bill would make that discretionary on the part of the city or county as to whether or not they wanted to allow motorized vehicle traffic through the common consumption area.
Thank you. Senator Faust-Godot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, on those same lines of questioning on page 3, you just stated that the city shall do this now, so we're just given a little leeway of allowing the person who is having the event to perhaps they might utilize members of their organization to stand at the end of the road and tell people don't come through, or can they just put up signs or those little orange cones? Or so just clarifying, we're giving the event holder the option of kind of blocking off those areas.
Current law requires that the boundaries for the area be clearly marked by either a physical barrier or an apparent line clearly distinguishing that it's a common consumption area. The bill further expands and allows for appropriate signage to be used to indicate where that boundary line is. Most of those boundaries, I presume, are dictated by the municipality that's creating the common consumption area and setting the parameters for what's going to occur and when those common consumption areas can be used for consumption of alcoholic liquor.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're just kind of taking, so we are alleviating the city from totally requiring it and leaving it up to the members of who's hosting the venue to put up the signs. Who's going to put up the signs?
No, the city would work with whatever organization it's working with for whatever event in terms of signage. What the bill is really doing is just giving the cities and the counties some discretion in terms of whether or not to allow vehicles to travel through the common consumption area.
Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. We've got actually just 3 oral testimony proponents here. Representative Tory Blue is unable to be here, so we will move on to Whitney Dameron. We'll give you each 5 minutes, and I'll give you the 1-minute cue, 30-second cue, and close it up if necessary. Whitney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Whitney Dameron, appearing on behalf of City of Topeka. Appreciate the background from Jason on this. My testimony indicates that our police chief, Brian Wheels, was going to be here. He had something else that came up this morning. I think we're all still safe, but nonetheless, he may or may not walk in. Amanda Stanley has come from another hearing, city attorney, so she could respond. As Jason described, what we're asking you to do with this bill is to allow not to have to close the streets. And I'll just kind of jump right to the case. In downtown Topeka, we've had a lot of investment in recent years. You've seen the Cyrus Hotel, we've got the Brew Bank, we've got the Pennant. You go down the street, you've got the Iron Rail, and you've got the Evergy Plaza. And so at times we have blocked the streets off and had downtown events, whether it's a First Friday event or Touch the Tractor or car shows and the like. And to do some of those things, you have to block off the streets, you have to block off traffic, which cuts off a lot of parking. It also, what we'd like to be able to do is to continue to have people to get close to downtown, perhaps go to a place like the Iron Rail, go across the street to Evergy Plaza where they're having a concert or something like that, maybe move down the street so that we can keep the traffic flowing. Similar in North Topeka, an area called Noto, I think you have testimony from them, written only. Narrow street, long, little parking. They have a number of art studios, concert venue, bars and the like. This would allow people to move up and down the street without having to, for example, pour your drink out at one place to go to another and get a glass of wine or something like that. The way this works is common consumption area is set about either through a local city ordinance or a county resolution. At that point in time, boundaries are discussed. Law enforcement, obviously, in the case of City of Topeka, comes in. This is what we need to do to run a safe operation. There's certainly public education for the licensees that are involved and their participation as well. You'll see in the bill, or in my testimony as well, where we worked with the director at ABC to come up with some language that would require signage so that people know when they're entering or leaving one of these common consumption areas. Certainly in the case of Topeka, and I think all communities, law enforcement's going to be present. They're walking up and down the streets. They're making sure that people are operating in a safe and responsible manner, just like we had a couple of days ago on Saturday when you had the downtown Topeka St. Patrick's Day Parade. Law enforcement comes out for those kinds of events, and we certainly envision that. And we've had that with common consumption areas. And so in closing, I'd just say the peanut is to allow a little more flexibility to cities and counties when you have instances where it might not make sense or it can be operated responsibly without shutting down the streets. People are not walking back and forth unfettered in the traffic. You have to go to the crosswalks, you have to pay attention to the traffic lights and things like that. So we're confident that law enforcement can handle this responsibility, and the bill was passed in the House 116-6, which is pretty good for a liquor bill. And be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee.
Thank you, Whitney. We'll hold questions till after we have all our proponent testimony. Spencer Duncan is up next, Government Affairs Director of the League of Kansas Municipalities.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little shorter than Whitney. There we go. Yes, I am the Government Affairs Director for the League of Kansas Municipalities. I also sit on the City Council here in Topeka. My primary function today is to tell you is that the cities of Kansas very much would like this authority. This was brought to the League by the city, and we had our meeting back in October, our membership meeting. There was a resounding, yes, we would all really love to have some flexibility. The Common Consumption Law was passed several years ago, has been effective for special events, and some cities have taken great advantage of it, and it's worked out wonderfully. But as you learn as time goes on, things evolve, and you realize, hey, we could expand this a little bit, and we could actually make it work for us more full-time. You will have cities like the Topekas of the world who will say, yep, we want to use this on a somewhat permanent basis pretty regularly. You'll have other cities who will use it just for certain times of the year, and you'll have other cities who won't use it at all. But for us as cities, it's about giving us some flexibility. Senator Foscato, to your point, it's not giving the event folks any additional authority. It's giving the cities the authority to continue to tell the event folks how they're going to run those things. So it will make sure that city councils will still make all the rules. They will be responsible for the signage. If they want to establish a district, conversation will happen on the local level, and then we'll all move forward from there. I think one of the questions too that came up on the House side was, how does this impact traffic laws? It doesn't. So as Mr. Dameron said, you can't just run across the street. You still got to use the crosswalk. You still have to follow all the regular laws that are in place. You can't drive through the district with alcohol in your car, right? All that still is going to be illegal. So we've tried very hard to clarify all those. And I think you'll see different cities establish different rules on how they track how alcohol is sold, how they know who sold it. We were down at a trip down to Arkansas where they have a small economic district that they've used this, and they've set up special hours, and they've used wristbands and different colored cups to make sure that law enforcement then has tools to enforce that. And so that's what the cities are asking here today. And as I said, my primary function is to tell you that the cities are all in on this and would really like the ability to do it. So thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Spencer. Next up, Scott Schneider, Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. Scott, you've got 5 minutes or whatever you want to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Scott Schneider with the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. We support this bill because we think it's well ordered. The Common Consumption Act is something that has proven to work well, and it works well because there's understandings of who's responsible for what piece of the transaction. Restaurants understand how to behave and how to provide cups and the things that they have to do inside a common consumption area. And the cities understand how to make these things work. I printed off a list of the different cities across the state of Kansas over the last year that have used common consumption, and there are 23 applicants or permits that were issued. Small cities, big cities, some cities use a temporary permit instead of a common consumption area. This gives them the flexibility to, one, take advantage of a lot of the investments they've made downtown, whether it's parking or traffic flow, whether it's the Lenexa City Center, Topeka, Wichita, or even some of the smaller communities. And we think this continues to be well ordered, and we would support that as it gives local governments more adaptability to create more interesting events. So with that, I'd stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Committee, we also have 2 written-only proponents in your, well, online, basically. And before we get to our neutral testimony, are there any questions for the proponents of this bill? Seeing none. There's no opponent testimony, and so our only neutral oral testimony comes from Debbie Beavers from ABC. Debbie?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Debbie Beavers, Director of Alcoholic Beverage Control. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. We are neutral on this bill. Just a little bit of background. ABC was part of the group that worked out this language back in the 2017 session. The language was kind of a blend of what worked in downtown Omaha and also the Kansas City Power and Light District. The Lenexa market is a good example of how that was kind of envisioned on how the common consumption area permits would work. However, that is not how they're being used at all. Much to our surprise, the common consumption areas may be multiple blocks wide and deep, and some cities have a requirement where they have to get permission to use it. Some cities don't. It's just kind of a hodgepodge on how they're being used. Some people actually get a common consumption permit so that they can do one event and then they'll surrender the permit. So we're seeing them being utilized in a wide variety of ways. But right now, the law requires the streets to be closed during such events. With this change, while it seems simple and local control is good, it creates a little confusion because really only the local government's going to know if the street should be closed or not. And so that is ABC's comment on that. The House committee did work with us, and we got the signage. We're comfortable with that language. And so I just felt it was important to point out some of the history how they're working today, because they're used in a variety of ways. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be happy to stand for questions.
Committee, are there any questions for Debbie on this? I do have one. Would you be more comfortable in just defining a length of a permit or something like that to make sure that the permit's, not open-ended?
These
sure about
permits are valid for 1 year, and they are permitted for the entire year. And while they're not used all the time, the permit holder is actually responsible for that area during the whole year. And I don't think that some of these folks that hold the permits realize or understand that. There could be additional liability for during these events if the streets aren't closed. That's something that's kind of up in the air, but they are a 1-year permit.
Would it be better to, and I'm just throwing it out there, have a shorter period of time for the permits and for each event? Or it sounds like some of the cities, I know you have the permanent, like the Power and Light District in Kansas City, where it's just something's going on all the time. Have you had discussions with the proponents of the bill with regard to that?
We have not. That's up for the legislature to set the policy.
All righty. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. As I said, there's no other additional testimony on this bill. We will close the hearing on House Bill 2059. Committee, we've got 3 bills we're going to hear tomorrow. We'll try to also keep them nice and tight within the hour time frame. And no other work for today. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.